Coming up, the $40 million collection apparently tied to a former Olympian who's now among the world's most wanted. Plus, what really happened to Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 and the 239 people on board? Why we might be one step closer to solving one of aviation's biggest mysteries. I'm Nick Smith, in for Nichole Berlie in Chicago. You're watching NewsNation Live. Today, pressure on Iran.
We'll knock the hell out of them.
President Trump's strong words for Tehran amid talks the country is rebuilding its weapons program.
I hope they're not trying to build up again, because if they are, we're going to have no choice but very quickly to eradicate that buildup.
We're live from the White House with new details. Allegations of fraud.
This is the epicenter of some of the biggest fraud and waste and abuse in this area.
NewsNation is digging into claims Minnesota daycares and assisted living facilities are wrapped up in a massive fraud scandal. We're live in Minnesota. Police on alert from New York to New Orleans. Security is ramping up ahead of celebrations. And a race against the clock to find a Texas teen who disappeared on Christmas Eve.
We're looking at that whole spectrum of possibilities.
What investigators believe happened to this 19-year-old and why dash cam video could provide some answers. We begin this hour at the White House, where the Trump administration is ramping up pressure on Iran. Warning of new military strikes if the country rebuilds its nuclear program. President Trump telling reporters the U.S. is prepared to knock Iran down if the country is moving forward with plans, as Tehran denies the allegations. This comes months after the United States launched strikes on Iran's nuclear enrichment sites in June, which at the time the president said were fully obliterated. Correspondent Kelly Meyer is at the White House with more. Kelly, good afternoon.
Yeah, hey there, Nick. So President Trump brings up that summer strike on Iran's nuclear facilities and the work of the B-2s in nearly every press conference he has. And he now says he hears Iran is trying to rebuild its nuclear facility and warns of very powerful consequences, he says, for Iran if it does. Now, in a press conference with Israel's prime minister on Monday, the president said he heard Iran was building up weapons. He said if they are, it is not from the sites that he hit back in June during Operation Midnight Hammer. Now, in that operation, U.S. airstrikes hit Iran's nuclear facilities at places like Fordow and Natanz. But Trump says those could be at possibly different sites where they could be rebuilding now. Now, those B-2s from Whiteman Air Force Base that NewsNation visited earlier this year, they flew from Missouri to Iran and took out 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities using those bunker-busting bombs. It's the only aircraft that could hold the weight of those bombs. Now, President Trump claimed that the U.S. obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities, but it's still unclear just how far back its nuclear program was actually set back. Here's more from the president yesterday.
Now I hear that Iran is trying to build up again, and if they are, we're going to have to knock them down. We'll knock them down. We'll knock the hell out of them, but hopefully that's not happening. I heard Iran wants to make a deal. If they want to make a deal, that's much smarter.
Now, the president of the National Iranian American Council said this in response to the president. Quote, President Trump likely views his own reckless comments as diplomatic posturing to pressure Iran to the table, but such rhetoric risks seriously backfiring and is more likely to remove diplomatic off-ramps, which also serves Netanyahu's agenda, not America's, end quote. President Trump also said he would support an Israeli attack on Iran if Iran continues with their ballistic missile and nuclear program. Nick?
Kelly, quick question for you. Strong words from the president, but how is Iran responding?
Yeah, that's something we are watching today and working to get more reaction from the country, because we are seeing these widespread protests across the country and now even also spreading to universities. You see some video there. Those protests are really against the economic situation in Iran, which is really dismal right now. Iran's currency hit a record low against the dollar. Many in Iran already struggling with the cost of living. You see footage there was showing social media protests. And we have this, that Iran's inflation is at a startling 42%, and Iran's currency is at a record low, sparking those protests in Iran and across Iran. Now, Iran's president, he is urging authorities to listen to the legitimate demands, he says, of the protesters. So this is something we are watching. It's one of the largest protests we've seen in years in Iran. Nick.
Kelly Meyer live at the White House. Kelly, thank you so much.
There's a major explosion in the dock area where they load the boats up with drugs. They load the boats up with drugs. So we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area. It's the implementation area. That's where they implement, and that is no longer around.
President Trump following through on his threats of land strikes in Venezuela, hitting a port facility last week that was believed to be storing drugs. The attack puts more pressure on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who has not commented directly on that strike. Until now, the United States has been conducting military strikes on suspected drug boats and seizing sanctioned oil tankers, all in international waters. But this time, the CIA conducted the strike. NewsNation's Joe Khalil is following the story for us and joins us live from Capitol Hill. Joe, good afternoon.
Yeah, hey, Nick. So since the beginning of this bombing campaign, President Trump has pretty consistently said that amid these boat strikes in the water, land strikes could be next. And he seemingly now has made good on that promise. As you just played, President Trump himself confirming that the strike last week on a Venezuelan port was conducted by the United States. President Trump says that that was done targeting an area, a dock, where the group Tren de Aragua loads and unloads drugs. And this would mark the first strike that is actually on Venezuelan land, on a dock, rather than in the water. CNN was first to report that this is actually a CIA drone strike. NewsNation has not independently confirmed that element of the story, even considering that the U.S. has been continuing to strike these drug boats off the coast of Venezuela. We've killed more than 100 people. Dozens of boats have been hit. This recent strike on land does appear to be a bit of an escalation between the U.S. and Venezuela and could lead to even more aggression, possibly even more strikes on land. This is something else that President Trump said to reporters when talking about this strike and how it was conducted here.
97% of the drugs coming in by sea stopped. We're trying to figure out who the other 3% are. They have a hard time getting people to pilot those boats. But 97% of the drugs coming in by the ocean, by the sea, by water, are gone. Every boat that we take out, we save 25,000 lives of Americans.
Now, since the boat strikes began, you've seen several of President Trump's allies here in Congress celebrating them, agreeing with what President Trump just said there, that they believe this is a successful bombing campaign that's been a deterrent for drug traffickers. But as Secretaries Hegseth and Rubio have come to Capitol Hill several times to brief members of Congress, there certainly are elements within the Republican Party here and virtually every Democrat here on Capitol Hill that are concerned about these strikes, not getting enough information about them, and also the possibility that if these strikes continue to move from the water to land, what you may have is the U.S. bogged down in another foreign war, potentially. So we've continued to hear those concerns. Congressman Mark Pocan, for one, a Democrat, has said, quote, Congress must be involved. Briefings, appearances before committees, everything. Only Congress can authorize going to war, he says. And again, there are several Democrats who agree with that sentiment. We should mention we did reach out to the White House today to try to confirm that it was, in fact, the CIA that launched this strike. The White House tells us, Nick, no comment on their end of the story.
And, Joe, there are still members of Congress who have questions as well. Joe Khalil, live for us at the Capitol. Joe, thank you so much. Here now to help us dive deeper on some of this is retired U.S. Air Force Brigadier General John Teichart. General Teichart, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. Let's jump right into this. First, President Trump talked a little about this apparent land strike in Venezuela while hosting Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Florida yesterday. Let's take a listen and chat on the other side.
Yeah, there was a major explosion in the dock area where they load the boats up with drugs. They load the boats up with drugs. So we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area. It's the implementation area. That's where they implement, and that is no longer around.
No longer around. General Teichart, would you consider this a major escalation by the United States?
Nick, I think this is the most ginger and timid of likely escalations. And what I mean by that is that this didn't accompany with a bunch of the fanfare that some of these boat strikes have seen, that it was on an unpopulated remote area. It was at a time where no people were killed. It wasn't a military target, but a drug target. And so I think this is the president starting to take steps to try to emphasize to Maduro that he is serious and not bluffing about eventually striking against land targets. But I do find it very interesting that he mentioned this briefly on Monday, actually on a New York radio program last Friday, and the strike likely took place on Christmas Eve. And again, because of the lack of fanfare, this is being rolled out as a very timid type of escalation that may signal slightly to Maduro, but likely isn't going to move the needle in the mind of the leader of Venezuela.
Yeah, General Tykar, when you and I spoke last week, we talked about whether or not we believed Maduro was getting the message. I asked you whether or not you thought that these strikes, whether Maduro understood that President Trump, by his own words, says that he's serious.
No, so I actually don't believe that Maduro believes that Trump is serious, that his inner circle has been telling Maduro that this is all a bluff, that the Ford Carrier Strike Group has been in the Caribbean for 6 weeks and done absolutely nothing kinetically against Venezuela. And this CIA drone strike, if that's what it is again a very small step of escalation. But everything the president has been doing is indicative of a president that does not want to get kinetically involved in a large-scale way in Venezuela. Maduro knows that, which likely just makes Maduro all the more resolute to not budge, to not step aside, and to see if he can call the bluff of the president.
Resolute and not one to step aside, but you and I both talked about this pressure campaign continues to mount, particularly when we see members of Russia's parliament pulling delegates out of Venezuela because Putin has made it clear things seem to be escalating. China also doing the same.
It is very possible at some point that we will see a type of escalation. But I think the clash, Nick, is going to come if Maduro continues to believe that the president is not serious, and President Trump realizes that in order to maintain his credibility, he's got to actually follow through on the threats in a large-scale way that he's been making for several weeks now. And only when that clash comes to a head could we see the president take the steps to maintain credibility that would allow us to recognize that he is indeed serious about kinetic strikes within Venezuela?
Because you and I talked about this last week, there is nothing feasible you can see Maduro doing as far as retaliation from Venezuela, and he has been given a clear exit plan.
He has, and I think the most dangerous job on the planet is being an ex-dictator, which means that when you move on somewhere without your inner circle, then you become vulnerable. And I think Maduro, because he's being told the president of the United States is bluffing, is not willing to take the risk to step aside and is willing to weather some of these economic and maybe military storms in the near future until he is firmly convinced that the president of the United States is going to take aggressive action against him and his inner circle.
And his inner circle, which continue to insulate him. Also pivotal in the Trump administration's pressure campaign on Maduro are the strikes on alleged drug boats that have been taking place since early September. There are now 30 that we know of, which have resulted in over 100 deaths. Do you, General Tykar, believe that the response from critics who say the service members carrying out these strikes are potentially creating legal risks for themselves?
Nick, I think it's more important here to realize that nobody sees a direct link between striking these boats and putting pressure on Maduro. Now, I think the blockade of sanctioned tankers is causing pressure because it diminishes the budget of Venezuela by about 50%. But I think a lot of these drug boat strikes are performative for internal domestic consumption within the United States. And because there's no link to doing anything to pressure Maduro, that I think the United States public is wondering, what are we doing and why, and how does this link to a bigger strategy?
And we heard the president say that each one of these boats that takes out those drug traffickers saves 25,000 lives here in the United States. I do want to switch gears because of the breaking news and developing overnight. Talk about Iran. President Trump saying he's promising to go after Iran once more if the country seeks to build up its missile reserves or reconstitutes its nuclear program. Let's take a listen and talk about that.
Now I hear that Iran is trying to build up again, and if they are, we're going to have to knock them down. We'll knock them down. We'll knock the hell out of them, but hopefully that's not happening. I heard Iran wants to make a deal. If they want to make a deal, that's much smarter. You know, they could have made a deal the last time before we went through, you know, a big attack.
General Tykart, I want to close on this there. We know what Israel wants in this situation. What does the United States want, and what do you make of the latest tensions with Iran?
Nick, it's pretty clear that the President of the United States, number one, is not going to allow a nuclear-armed Iran. But I think, number two, going back almost a year to the negotiations that started between the United States and Iran, that the President of the United States would love to find a way to normalize relations with Iran and to drag them back into the world economic and political situation. I think actually the economic woes in Iran are potentially something that could cause the Ayatollah to want to deal directly with the United States to find a way out of the isolation that Iran has seen thus far. And so we'll see if some of the verbal threats from the president are enough to bring the Ayatollah and the people of Iran to the negotiating table, like the president's threats did almost a year ago when he took office.
General Tykart, once again, thanks so much for being here this afternoon, and happy holidays to you and your family.
You as well, Nick. Thanks.
A man accused of planting pipe bombs outside the Democratic and Republican National Committee offices on the eve of January 6th, 2021, is set to appear in federal court in the next hour. Prosecutors say Brian Cole Jr. has given a detailed confession to the act. Cole told investigators he suspected the 2020 presidential election had been tampered with and believes someone needed to, quote, speak up about it. The homemade bombs did not detonate and were discovered on January 6th as Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol to halt the formalizing of then President-elect Joe Biden's victory. Up next on NewsNation, on the ground, uncovering new details tied to a massive tax fraud scandal that might have targeted more than just daycares. Plus, two teens go missing from the same county in Texas just days apart. The sheriff investigating both cases joins us live with alarming new details.